Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. This week, AJC's Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer, Jason Isaacson, sat down for a live conversation with Steve Witkoff, the U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East. They discussed plans to rebuild Gaza, political upheaval in Syria and Lebanon, and expansion of the Abraham Accords. For this week's episode, we bring you that live conversation.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Special Envoy Witkoff, for participating in this evening's program, introducing AJC Center for New Middle East, an extension and refocusing of the work that we've been doing for decades to advance Arab-Israeli understanding, cooperation, and peace. Your presence here means a great deal to us. As you've heard from my colleagues, AJC looks forward to working with you and your team in any way that we can to help assure the success for a secure Israel fully integrated in the Middle East. Now, let me begin by thanking you again, renewing our thanks, and thanking President Trump for your relentless efforts, which began even before the president took office, to assure the liberation of the hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza, now for 508 days. We know how dedicated you are and the president is to gaining the release of Idan Alexander, the last living American hostage, and the remains of the four other Americans, Itai Chen, Gadi and Judy Weinstein Chagai, and Omer Nutra, and all of the hostages, living and dead, still held captive by the terrorists. So I want to point out that leaders of the Hostage Families Forum are with us here this evening, as is Emma Tsurkoff, whose sister Elizabeth Tsurkoff was kidnapped by terrorists in Iraq 2 years ago. We are all counting on your and your colleagues' continued efforts to free them all. Thank you again, Steve. Now, my first question to you: how does a successful real estate developer make the transition to Middle East diplomacy, as you certainly have? Clearly, there are profound territorial issues at play here, but there are also powerful intangible factors, perhaps less easily negotiated, factors of historical narrative, of religion, of nationalism. How do you cut through all that? How do you achieve success, given the very different career that you've pursued up to this point?
Well, first of all, Jason, thank you for having me, and welcome everybody. And to the hostage families, I just want to welcome you here. Some of the people I probably have talked to already, and just know that my heart is always with you. You know, I'm a very close friend of President Trump's. Yeah. And I think he felt that hopefully that I could do a good job here. And so I think the job had a lot to do with miscommunication and correcting that. It had a lot to do with getting over to the region and understand what was happening. And maybe most importantly, it had a lot to do with his election and peace through strength, and the perception that he was going to take a different path, that the old policy prescriptions that had not worked in the Middle East were not going to be tolerated by him anymore. And I think that's in large part what allowed us to get a positive result. Adding to that, of course, was all of the good work that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his administration had achieved with Nasrallah, Hezbollah in Lebanon. He had basically gutted Hamas. So many good things had happened. And, you know, on top of that, the raids in Iran. And it created this perception that a lot of what emanated out of October 7th was never going to be tolerated again. And that began the pathway to achieving the result we achieved in the first phase. But that's just half of the problem. So we've got a lot more to go.
I've got some questions about that as well, as you can imagine. Help us understand the president's priorities and therefore your focus in this very complicated region. There's the continued trauma of October 7th, 2023. Dozens of Israeli and other hostages still held by Hamas terrorists in Gaza, and the deep wounds inflicted on Israeli society in that attack. There's the need to rebuild Gaza and to assure it is no longer governed by Hamas. There's the prospect of advancing normalization between Israel and Arab states, building on the Abraham Accords of the first Trump administration. There are also political upheavals and some hopeful signs, although the jury is still out, in Lebanon and in Syria. And there's the ongoing threat to peace and stability posed by the Iranian regime. How do you prioritize? What are your expectations for success on these many tracks? It's an awful lot to deal with.
That was, I think I counted like 14 questions
Exactly.
you just had.
This is my specialty, by the way.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I can see. I have to now, you're testing my memory on all of this.
Priorities.
Yeah, I would say, how does the president think about it? Well, first and foremost, he wants something different for the region.
Yeah.
And different in the sense that the old way of thinking, they've rebuilt Gaza 3 or 4 times already. Like, that's just an unacceptable use of resources. We need to do it in a much better way, A. B, we need to get rid of this crazy ideological psychopathic way of thinking that Hamas thinks. What they did, it can never be tolerated. I saw a film that many in this room did not see, made by Southern Command when I was in Gaza, and it's horrific. I mean, it is a horrific film, what happened in this film and what they did to people. So this is not the act of people who are going to war. This is the act of barbarians, and it can never be tolerated. Normalization is critical for the region. Saudi Arabia embraces it because they can't finance in their own markets today. And why? Because there's so much war risk. I actually saw Jamie Dimon today, and I discussed it with him, and I said to him, think about an area like Saudi Arabia. They have tons of money, but they can't leverage their money. And they can't because the underwriting risk on war, it can't be underwritten. So you're not going to see typical senior financing go into those marketplaces. They can finance if they do a deal in New York, and they can't finance in their own country. It makes no sense. And that's going to lead to a lot of stability. In terms of the Iranian crescent, it's basically been decimated. Look at what's happened with Syria. No one ever thought that that was going to happen. We've got an epic election in Lebanon. And so tons of things happening. Lebanon, by the way, could actually normalize and come into the Abraham Peace Accords, as could even potentially Syria. So many profound changes are happening there, and yet it's been a flashpoint of conflict. And I think that there's a possibility that we end it now. Do we have to make sure that Egypt is stabilized? Yes. They've got some issues, economic and financial issues, and also on their streets. Same thing with Saudi Arabia, and we have to be cognizant about that. But all in all, I think there are some really good things that are happening.
Yeah, and I hope with your intervention and the president's power, more good things will happen in the coming months.
We're hopeful.
So you've recently returned from your latest trip to the region with meetings at the highest levels in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates. Next Tuesday in Cairo will be a meeting of the Arab League to discuss the future of Gaza. What is your sense, and this drills down on your last answer, what is your sense of the region's readiness to advance to the next phase of negotiations to free the Israeli hostages, to shift to a new Israeli force posture in and around Gaza, and put a governing structure in place that excludes terrorists? Can we assure that Hamas no longer rules, no longer poses a threat, that its missiles, tunnels, and other infrastructure in Gaza are destroyed?
Well, central to the May 27th protocol that was signed with the Biden administration and the Israelis, central to that is that Hamas cannot have any part of a governing structure in Gaza. And that's a red line for the Israelis, but it's a red line for us too. You see the film, and we have to thread that needle in phase 2 of the negotiations.
So how do we get there?
We're not entirely sure yet, but we are working. We're making a lot of progress. Israel is sending a team right now as we speak. It's either going to be to Doha or to Cairo, where negotiations will begin again with the Egyptians and with the Qataris. And I may, if that negotiation goes positively enough, this is the initial phase of the negotiation where we've set some boundaries, some contours about what we want to talk about and what the outcomes we expect to happen. This is from the United States at the direction of President Trump. If it goes well, maybe I would be able to go on Sunday to execute and finish an arrangement. That's what we're hoping for.
Put phase 2 on track.
Put phase 2 on track and have some additional hostage release. And we think that that's a real possibility. We had a lot of conversation this morning about that, and with all of the parties I'm talking about, and people are responsive. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. That's a very chaotic place, the Middle East.
But you've got cooperation from the Quint, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, Egypt, Qatar.
Yes. All of those countries in that region, they want to see stability. There's new young leadership there. Everybody understands that it's untenable to be at war all the time. It just doesn't work. And it's setting everybody back. Look at Israel, by the way. They're conscripting people at 50 years old. to go to the fight. That's
And reservists are being called back to duty again and again.
correct. People can't work, by the way. Economies are suffering throughout there. But on the other hand, Hamas can't be tolerated either, and yet we need to get the hostages back into
And
the
Israel is
families.
still resilient as hell.
Pardon me?
Israel is still resilient.
Of course it is. Of course it is. But we look, I don't want to talk about all these things and not acknowledge that the primary objective has got to be to bring those hostages home. It has to be.
I mentioned the Quint before: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, Egypt, Qatar. Egypt and Jordan, longtime peace partners with Israel, were proposed by the president as the possible place in which Palestinians evacuated from Gaza could be housed temporarily, or perhaps more than temporarily. What is your sense of the possibility of the dislocation of Palestinians from Gaza? Is that essential to the idea of rebuilding Gaza or not essential?
Well, first of all, let me acknowledge King Abdullah and also the Egyptians. General Hassan, who runs their intelligence unit, President Sisi, their ambassador. They're dug in. They're focused on solutions. It's a complicated situation right now. But they've done a great job, and they've been available. And whenever I call them, they're responsive. The Jordanians have had a tough trip here, but, they've managed through it. But let's just talk sort of about what the president talks about. Why is he talking about Gaza in the way he's talking about it? It's because for the last 4 decades, the other ways of thinking have not worked. We sort of always get back to this place. First of all, it's a giant slum. It really is, by the way, and it's a slum that's been decimated. On top of that, I was the first American official to go there in 22 years. I was literally there, in the tunnels, on the battlefield. It is completely destroyed. There's 30,000 shells that are laying all over that battlefield, in large part because the Biden administration held up munitions shipments to the Israelis, and they were firing 1973 vintage ammunition that didn't explode. Who would let their children wander around these places? In New York, there would be yellow tape around it. Nobody would be allowed to come in. They were digging tunnels so everything underneath, subterranean, is Swiss cheese, and then it got hit by 2,000-pound bunker bombs. So you could have dust down there. It's so devastated. I just think that President Trump is much more focused on how do we make a better life for people? How do we change the educational frameworks? Right now, people are growing up there in textbooks in the first grade. They're seeing AK-47s and how you fire them. That's just insanity what's going on out there. So we have to directionally change how people are thinking there, how they're going to live together. People talk about two-state. We at the Trump administration talk about how do you get to a better life? If you have a home in Gaza in the middle of a slum that hasn't been fixed up correctly, is that as good as aspirationally having a great job and being able to know that you can send your kids to college and they can become lawyers or doctors and so forth? That, to me, is what we want to achieve. And when we began talking about Gaza, we were not talking about a giant eviction plan. What we were talking about was the fact, unlike the Biden administration, and this is not a knock on them, it's that they didn't do their work correctly. The Biden administration, that May 27th protocol is based on a 5-year redevelopment plan. You can't demolish everything there and clean it up in 5 years, let alone X-ray it on a subterranean level and figure out what foundations exist or what conditions exist to hold foundations and then what we should build. It's easily a 15-year plan, and it might be 20 or 25 years. And the Wall Street Journal, one of the most mainstream publications 2 days ago, finally came out with a major article talking about that and basically validating what we've been talking about. Once you understand it from that perspective, you understand it's not about an eviction plan. It's about creating an environment there for whoever's going to live there that's better than it's ever been in the last 40 years.
Steve, thank you. Before October 7th, 2023, the betting in many foreign policy circles, as you know, was that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel were closing in on a deal to normalize relations, coupled with an enhanced security agreement between the U.S. and Saudi governments and Saudi access to the full nuclear fuel cycle under U.S. safeguards. Where would you say that formula stands today? Is that still the framework that you're expecting will describe the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia and between Saudi Arabia and Israel?
Well, that's why I keep on going back to the May 27th protocol, because it's chock full of misinformation. And so the Saudis were operating, as were the Israelis, as if you could redevelop and reconstruct Gaza in 5 years. You can't. You can finish demolition, you can finish refuse removal. You can do all of that in 5 years, but for that, nothing else is going to get accomplished. So when the Saudis talked normalization with the Israelis and defense treaty, they were thinking about it on a 5-year time frame. Once you begin to think about it as a 15 or a 20-year deal, it almost begs the question, are Gazans going to wait? Do they even want to wait? I mean, if you're a mother and a father and you've got 3 kids, do you want to wait 20 years to maybe have a nice, safe home there? And this has nothing to do with relocation. Maybe we should be talking about relocation, or the ability to come back, later on. But right now, right here, right now, Gaza is a long-term redevelopment plan. And I think once the Saudis begin to incorporate that into their thinking, and the Egyptians, and UAE, and everybody who has a vested interest in Gaza, I think you're going to see development plans that more mirror the way the president is thinking than what the May 27th protocol contemplated.
Are you suggesting that the possibility of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia will come after there is a fully formed Gaza redevelopment plan?
I think so, because
fully implemented Gaza redevelopment plan.
I believe that. I believe it's just sequentially logical, because that's when you begin to think about how Gazans are going to think about it. Right now, we're talking about it in the abstract. And there are many countries, by the way, out there that, from a humanitarian standpoint, we've talked to many of them, are actually extending themselves and saying, hey, look, we'd love to be a part of some sort of permanent solution for the Gazan people. No one wants to see the Gazan people in some sort of diaspora. They're sort of disengaged, and that doesn't work. That only is going to fester and lead to more radicalism in the region. So we've got to get a solution for it, but we need to level set the facts first. And the facts have not been level set. They've been thinking about this from the perspective of facts that are inaccurate. Now we've level set those facts. We're going to conduct a summit pretty soon with probably the biggest developers in the Mideast region, many of the Arab developers, lots of master planners. I think when people see some of the ideas that come from this, they're going to be amazed.
Steve, thank you. Final question. From AJC's many contacts and visits over many years across the Arab world, including regular exchanges over 3 decades in Gulf Cooperation Council countries, we've come to believe in the inevitability of Israel's full integration in the region. That the more the region's leaders and elites focus on the potential advantages to their societies, including their security of normal relations with Israel, the more likely it is that we'll achieve that goal. Is that the sense that you have as well from where you sit?
I do. Look, I think that the people of Israel want to live in peace with the people of the Middle East, and it could be an incredible...
And vice versa.
And vice versa. I had a discussion with His Royal Highness's MBS's brother yesterday, the defense minister, an exceptional man, by the way, and we talked about how Saudi could become one of the best investable markets out there when it can be financed. Think about this. The United States today has the greatest capital market system that the world knows. And when you have a great capital market system, when you can borrow, when you can lease a car, when you can buy a home and mortgage it, all those different things, it drives an economy, it propels it. Right now in the Middle East, it's very difficult to finance. The banks don't want to operate it. Why? Because tomorrow a Houthi missile could come in if you're building a data center and poof, it's gone. Banks don't have to underwrite that risk in New York City or Washington, D.C. or American cities. So as you get more stabilization there, I think the real estate values are going to go through the moon. And we talk about this. Israel is a bedrock of great technological innovation. I think, all of the Arab countries, UAE, Saudi, Qatar, they're into blockchain, robotics, they're into hyperscale data centers. These are the things that interest Israel, and yet they're driving so much of the tech surge out there. Imagine all of them working together. It could be an incredible region. So we're hopeful for that prospect. That's the way the president thinks about it. We talk at length about this, and he gives us the direction, and we follow it, and that's his direction.
I thought I heard applause about to begin, but I will ask you to hold for a second because I just want to thank you, Steve Witkoff, for sharing your vision and the president's vision for how to move forward to build a more stable and prosperous and peaceful Middle East. And you've laid it out for us, and we very much appreciate your coming here to talk about it.
Thank you.
If you missed last week's episode, be sure to tune in for my conversation with AJC Berlin director Remco Lemhus about the victory of a centrist right government in Germany's recent election and its plans to build a coalition excluding the far-right anti-Semitic political party, Alternative for Germany. Remco and I discussed why that party's unprecedented post-war election returns are a cause for concern. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.